The Dark Scrolls. In the vast silence of the Topkapi archives, dust lies over the bindings of leather and silk. Each roll of parchment exhales the faint scent of rosewater and age, a remnant of a world that glittered like gold and bled like iron. Within those documents, the decrees, the dowry lists, the careful genealogies written in curling script, breathes a single unspoken truth. The daughters of empire were never truly free. Their names shimmer across the pages like tracked light, beautiful yet confined. To open those records is to enter a labyrinth where power and fear shared the same perfume. Centuries ago, when the empire stretched from the Balkans to the deserts of Arabia, its capital stood as a living testament to divine order. The Sultan's palace rose above the Bosphorus, a fortress of domes and courtyards where the call to prayer mingled with the clatter of fountains. From its marble terraces, one could look east and see Asia, west and see Europe, the whole world seemingly folded at the ruler's feet. And yet, inside those gilded walls, another kingdom existed, one built of curtains, whispers, and obedience. It was here that the princesses of the House of Osman were born. Their births were occasions of ritual and dread. Court astrologers charted the stars, midwives recited verses, while eunuchs guarded the doors. The infant was swaddled not only in silk, but in expectation. Each girl was an emblem of alliance, a living seal upon treaties yet to be conceived. She would never be an individual, but a vessel of dynastic blood, the continuation of legitimacy itself. Before she could walk, her destiny had already been inked into the empire's ledgers. Inside the harem, the term so often misunderstood in later centuries, life unfolded according to a logic both sacred and cruel. It was less a place of pleasure than a mechanism of control. The women of the dynasty lived under rules more intricate than those of any army: hierarchy, surveillance, silence. The Sultan's mother reigned as Valide Sultan, her authority second only to the throne. Around her moved tutors, physicians, guards, servants, all sworn to secrecy. Within that maze, the young princess learned to lower her eyes and measure every word. She studied languages, the Quran, music, calligraphy, and the subtle art of dissimulation. Grace was survival. Innocence was peril. In the evenings, the corridors filled with the sound of distant instruments, lutes, tambourines, the low hum of prayers echoing through stone. Candles reflected on tile mosaics the color of night. Outside, Istanbul glittered with lanterns. Ships slid across the strait like silent shadows, but the princess seldom saw any of it. Her world ended at the lattice of her window, beyond which freedom shimmered like a mirage. The harem was a cage of beauty, its bars woven from gold thread. Chroniclers of the time wrote with reverence of the discipline within those quarters. They praised the virtue of the royal daughters, their modesty, their piety. Yet between the lines one senses another story, a faint tremor beneath the surface of order. Servants whispered of tears shed in the bathhouse, of letters burned before they reached their recipients, of girls who vanished when politics demanded silence. The documents never name them. They are only marks, erasures, blank spaces where lives once stood. The empire recorded its victories, not its sacrifices. As the princess grew, she became both symbol and hostage. Her presence in the palace ensured the loyalty of her father's ministers. Her potential marriage promised the continuation of alliances across the provinces. The system was as precise as clockwork. Each female member of the dynasty a calculated move in the preservation of rule. To disobey was to endanger not only oneself, but the delicate equilibrium of empire. That awareness settled over the girls like invisible chains. Even laughter became rehearsed. When they walked through the courtyards, veiled and attended by eunuchs, the courtiers lowered their gaze, not out of respect for the woman within, but for the power her blood represented. They were at once sacred and untouchable, both idol and prisoner. Many foreign envoys, writing in disbelief, compared the palace to a temple, its women priestesses bound to a faith of obedience. Those comparisons were not entirely wrong. The empire worshipped continuity, and the bodies of its princesses were the altars upon which that continuity was maintained. Among the pages of a certain fiscal record survives a detail both mundane and heartbreaking: the allocation of silks and jewels for the dowries of royal daughters. Each item is noted with care: pearls from the Red Sea, emeralds from Persia, brocade from Bursa. To the accountants, these were mere numbers. To history, they are fragments of a life already sold before its owner could consent. The splendor was not a privilege, but an armor forged by expectation. Under its weight, even love became treason. The palace protocol dictated that a princess's education included the study of diplomacy and restraint. She was taught to write letters in impeccable Arabic, to greet dignitaries with gestures that revealed nothing of her thoughts, to recite poetry about loyalty and patience. Each lesson carved away another piece of spontaneity. By adolescence, she understood that emotion was dangerous, that curiosity could be mistaken for ambition, and ambition for rebellion. The empire feared women who desired more than silence. Occasionally, during festivals, the sequestered daughters were permitted to watch the world beyond the gates. Processions of soldiers, markets alive with color, the call of merchants drifting through the air. Those brief glimpses were enough to seed imagination and despair. A few scribbled verses in the margins of prayer books speak of longing not for romance but for sky, for wind, for a moment unobserved. The official chroniclers ignored such trivialities, yet they survive as ghostly testimonies. The heart of a princess was not immune to the ache of confinement. The Ottoman world outside her lattice was a realm of relentless expansion and court intrigue. Viziers rose and fell, wars reshaped borders. Faith was wielded as instrument and excuse. Every victory demanded new alliances, and every alliance demanded collateral. In this economy of loyalty, the royal daughters were its most valuable currency. Their marriages could secure a governor's allegiance or pacify a rebellious province. The decision of whom they would wed was never theirs. The empire chose, and obedience was expected to be as natural as breath. Behind the ornate rhetoric of court historians, one discerns the machinery of coercion. The marriage contracts were less unions than decrees. Each one specified dowry, residence, servants, and, most importantly, the prohibition against returning to the palace without imperial consent. Once wed, a princess belonged to another world, geographically distant, socially isolated, politically useful. The splendor of her wedding was the last celebration she would ever witness as herself. From that day forward, she existed only as someone's wife, someone's pawn, someone's silence. Within the imperial library lies a small, unsigned chronicle describing the education of one such princess. Its author notes the precision of her handwriting, the elegance of her embroidery, the calm with which she received news of her betrothal. Nowhere does he mention what she felt. Perhaps he did not know, or perhaps he knew too well and dared not record it. The manuscript ends abruptly after the line, "The carriage departed before dawn." The rest of the page is blank, as if history itself paused to listen for her cries. Even the architecture of Topkapi spoke in metaphors of containment. Courtyards within courtyards, gates within gates, each threshold narrowing the passage between life and destiny. The women's quarters were designed so that voices could not carry, that corridors turned inward, like the coils of a shell. Light entered only through lattices carved in geometric patterns, scattering into fragments across the marble. It was a beauty meant to conceal. To live there was to learn that elegance could be another form of erasure. Foreign visitors, denied entry, constructed fantasies of the harem as paradise. Painters imagined odalisques reclining on cushions. Poets described gardens of sensual delight. They saw only the exterior walls, never the discipline behind them. The truth, preserved in the quiet records of servants, reveals an existence governed by fear of transgression. Every gesture was watched, every conversation reported. The slightest rumor could destroy a reputation, and with it a life. Silence was the only safety. From the vantage of centuries, it is tempting to romanticize this order, to mistake endurance for contentment. Yet the old manuscripts tell a subtler story. They describe the minute regulation of daily life, the times for prayer, the sequence of meals, the roster of attendants assigned to each woman. The structure was meant to ensure harmony, but beneath it pulsed anxiety. The princess knew that her worth depended not on her intellect or kindness, but on the usefulness of her existence to men she rarely saw. Such knowledge aged even the youngest faces. In one inventory of personal effects, a marginal note records a mirror, cracked by accident. Whether by accident or by frustration, no one can tell. The mirror, now lost, becomes a symbol of that unseen fracture. The moment when a girl realized that the reflection before her belonged to history, not to herself. The empire had written her into permanence. She, meanwhile, was fading. Toward the end of adolescence, preparations began for the inevitable. Diplomats whispered, suitors were evaluated for their political convenience, and astrologers sought favorable omens. In these months, the palace grew quiet around the chosen princess. Her tutors bowed lower. Her companions spoke less. She was being transformed into an offering, and everyone understood that to pity her was to question the will of the sultan. So the court smiled, and the machinery of ceremony began to move. By then, she had learned the language of endurance. When presented with gifts from her future husband, robes, perfumes, letters penned by scribes, she accepted them with serenity. The chroniclers praised her composure. None recorded the moment she stood at her window for the last time, watching the gulls circle above the Bosphorus, knowing she would never again breathe that air. The empire did not record farewells. The closing pages of the surviving court annals speak of triumph, of wealth distributed to the poor on her wedding day, of drums and prayers, of the Sultan's satisfaction. They do not speak of the silence that followed, the echo of her footsteps leaving the marble floors. For the palace, her departure was routine. For her, it was an exile wrapped in gold. To read those chronicles now is to sense the stillness between their lines, the absence louder than any proclamation. It is to realize that the grandeur of empire was built not only upon conquests, but upon the quiet surrender of its daughters. Each princess carried away a fragment of that palace in her heart, the scent of incense, the echo of music fading behind doors that would never open to her again. And so the story begins, not with a wedding, but with a departure. Not with love, but with obedience. The records fall silent, just as her new life was about to begin, leaving us only with imagination, empathy, and the faint rustle of parchment, as another unseen hand turns the page. The carriage that bore her away from Topkapi rolled through the gate of felicity before sunrise. Behind its curtains, the world was dissolving into pale mist, and the sea beyond the walls reflected the first thin line of dawn. Officially, it was a day of celebration, decreed by the Sultan himself, yet the air carried no laughter. Courtiers lined the route in ceremonial silence, while drums beat a rhythm that sounded less like joy than inevitability. The empire was witnessing the fulfillment of duty, a daughter departing to secure obedience in another man's province. The marriage of an Ottoman princess was never a private affair. It was a transaction conducted between throne and state, written in calligraphy and sealed with wax the color of blood. Each clause of the contract defined the borders of her existence. She would be given a palace appropriate to her rank, servants chosen by the crown, and an allowance from the treasury. In return, she would bring legitimacy to her husband's office, binding him to the dynasty by the most intimate chain imaginable. Love was neither expected nor desired. Affection, if it appeared, was considered a danger to discipline. Chroniclers described the process with an almost clinical precision. Once a match had been approved, officials calculated the dowry and dispatched emissaries bearing gifts, robes heavy with embroidery, jeweled daggers, and caskets of musk. The Sultan's signature transformed a woman into a treaty. Beneath the solemnity of the ritual lay the unspoken truth that no refusal was possible. To question one's destiny was to question divine order itself. The empire thrived on obedience, and obedience began in the heart of its daughters. As her procession crossed the city, the people gathered to watch. They shouted blessings, scattering petals across the cobblestones, unaware or unwilling to see the face behind the veil. The documents later would praise the magnificence of the occasion. The horses adorned with silver, the scent of frankincense trailing in the air, the banners of the provinces fluttering in salute. But no record mentions what she saw when she dared to lift the curtain. The fishermen at the harbor pausing to stare, the narrow alleys where children waved, the slow widening distance between herself and everything she had ever known. Beyond the walls of Istanbul, the road stretched for days, then weeks. Each turn of the wheel carried her deeper into a world mapped by men she had never met. Guards rode ahead, musicians followed, and at night the camp flickered with lamps, an illusion of safety amid the vastness of empire. Somewhere in those endless miles, the concept of self began to dissolve. She was no longer the child of Topkapi, but the promised wife of a man whose name was spoken in formal tones only. Pasha, governor, protector of the realm. The letters from the palace instructed her to show gratitude and restraint. "Remember," they said, "you carry the honor of the house of Osman. Your silence is your crown." When she arrived at her destination, a provincial capital framed by mountains, the city erupted in ceremony. The governor's palace had been redecorated for her arrival, fountains polished, carpets newly woven, corridors hung with mirrors to reflect her passage. The people rejoiced because her presence meant imperial favor, more taxes forgiven, more trade allowed. For them, she was fortune made flesh. For her, the air smelled of exile. She stepped through the gates, bowed as custom required, and entered the architecture of her new captivity. In those early months, letters traveled back and forth between her residence and the palace. They were formal, meticulous, devoid of sentiment. She reported her health, her observance of prayer, her gratitude to the Sultan. Between the lines, she hid small details. The withering of a rose garden, the strange taste of the local water, the way the wind howled against the shutters at night. The scribes who copied these letters probably never noticed, or pretended not to. But centuries later, reading those faded pages, one senses the quiet pulse of longing beneath their surface, like a heartbeat, muffled by distance. The court historians would later call such marriages bonds of loyalty. In truth, they were mechanisms of surveillance. The husband, elevated by royal connection, became both ally and subject. His household was now tied to the dynasty through the most fragile of threads, a woman whose life was measured by obedience. Should he ever betray the throne, his wife would serve as reminder and hostage. Her correspondence would be intercepted, her servants replaced by informants. The empire trusted its daughters only insofar as they remained instruments of control. There are records of certain governors who treated their royal wives with deference, even affection. Yet even in those unions, distance prevailed. The princess could not appear in public without veils and escorts. She could not travel to the capital without imperial permission. Her children, if any, were raised under watchful eyes to prevent the emergence of rival claims. The very blood that made her sacred also made her dangerous. Every embrace carried the weight of politics. Occasionally, rumors reached Istanbul of unrest within a distant marriage, whispers of quarrels, of a princess who refused to speak, of another who fell ill too suddenly. The responses were always the same: swift, silent, decisive. The empire valued appearances above all. If a husband's loyalty faltered, he was reassigned to a post farther from power. If a wife's behavior threatened scandal, her household was dissolved and she was confined to a smaller estate for reasons of health. The chronicles record none of this directly. They simply shift attention to other matters, as if history itself looked away. To understand the magnitude of these sacrifices, one must recall the world she left behind. Within Topkapi, she had been surrounded by ritual, yet also by familiarity. The scent of her tutor's ink, the sound of water in the courtyard, the whisper of slippers along marble floors. In her new home, everything was foreign. The dialect, the customs, the expectations. The servants bowed too deeply. The officials spoke in cautious tones. She had become a symbol, and symbols are rarely spoken to as equals. Isolation wrapped around her like a second veil. The empire's chroniclers praised such stoicism as virtue. They saw in her silence the proof of noble breeding, the endurance befitting a daughter of sultans. They could not, or would not, see that silence as the echo of absence. There were moments, preserved in fragments of oral memory, when a princess would order the musicians to stop playing mid-song, claiming fatigue. In truth, the melodies reminded her of Istanbul. Another was said to have forbidden mirrors in her chambers, unable to bear the reflection of a life no longer her own. These gestures, small and private, were the only rebellions permitted to her. From the imperial perspective, the system worked flawlessly. The provinces remained loyal, taxes flowed, the dynasty endured. But within the corridors of forgotten palaces, the cost accumulated invisibly. lives spent in quiet resignation, names fading from the record. The glory of empire depended upon a mathematics of obedience, and women's hearts were its unseen currency. One surviving travel account, written by a European envoy, describes attending such a provincial wedding. He admired the opulence, the carpets, the perfumes, the jewels. Yet even he noticed the strangeness of the ceremony. The bride, he wrote, stood unmoving, as if carved from ivory, while the music swelled around her. Her eyes were lowered, her face without expression. Only once did she lift her gaze, and in that instant the hall grew still. The envoy did not understand what he witnessed, not modesty, but resignation rehearsed to perfection. That gaze, brief, unrecorded, yet enduring in rumor, captures the essence of every such union. Behind the gold and the incense, there was a single, unanswerable question. What becomes of a soul when it is traded for stability? The empire offered no reply. It simply continued, vast and impersonal, devouring generations in the name of order. Years might pass before news from the capital reached her again. New wars, new sultans, new alliances. Sometimes she would receive word of the death of a relative, a sister married to another governor, a cousin confined for disobedience. The letters were written in the same formal tone that had defined her entire existence. Grief was expressed as gratitude for divine wisdom. The art of survival was the art of translation, turning pain into protocol. Among the records of the treasury appears a curious entry, an expenditure for pearls returned from the dowry of the deceased princess. No explanation follows. The pearls, once symbols of purity, re-entered circulation to adorn another ceremony, another illusion of joy. In the empire's accounting, even sorrow was recyclable. At times, her household became a miniature court, mirroring the one she had left. Poets sought her patronage, artisans presented gifts, clerics recited blessings in her honor. Yet the center of gravity always remained elsewhere. She could inspire loyalty but never command it. She could dispense charity but not justice. Her power existed only as reflection of another's will. To an outsider, the life seemed luxurious. To her, it was a perfection of stillness. A world where every movement had already been choreographed centuries before her birth. Occasionally, the governor's duties required campaigns against rebels or rival tribes. Then the palace grew silent, the corridors echoing with absence. In those nights, she might walk through the courtyard under the faint light of oil lamps, the sound of distant dogs breaking the monotony. The air smelled of dust and jasmine. Somewhere a servant whispered prayers. She would look at the mountains beyond the walls and wonder if her voice, were she to cry out, could reach them. History tells us she never tried. When the husband returned, garlanded with victory, new ceremonies followed. Feasts, musicians, gifts sent to Istanbul in gratitude. She stood beside him, veiled, the image of contentment. The empire demanded that image as proof that order prevailed. Beneath the fabric, she repeated the same words of blessing that had once been taught to her as a child. Patience is honor, silence is peace. Perhaps she believed them, perhaps she merely survived by reciting them. If there were children, they inherited the ambiguity of their mother's station. They were not royal enough to threaten the throne, yet too royal to vanish into anonymity. Sons entered military service. Daughters were married into local nobility, continuing the pattern. Thus the network expanded, invisible yet unbreakable. The blood of empire seeped quietly through its provinces, binding loyalty with lineage. Each generation forgot a little more of its origin, until memory itself became myth. By the time the princess reached middle age, she was both revered and forgotten. The courtiers addressed her with elaborate titles, yet few remembered her given name. Visitors bowed deeply, not out of affection but protocol. Her youth survived only in paintings commissioned long ago, where she appeared radiant beneath a halo of jewels. The woman who now walked those halls was a ghost haunting her own legend. The chronicles rarely mention the end of such lives. Death came without drama, usually described in a single line. The noble lady departed this world and was received by mercy. The body was transported back to Istanbul, buried in a family mausoleum near the sea. The stone bore no personal epitaph, only prayers for the dynasty's longevity. Within months, another marriage would be arranged, another procession prepared, another daughter dispatched along the same road. The empire's rhythm never faltered. To read these records is to confront the paradox at the heart of Ottoman grandeur. That stability was purchased through the quiet suffering of its women. Their obedience ensured peace. Their silence preserved power. Yet beneath that silence lies the faint vibration of resistance, the unrecorded thoughts, the glances, the unspoken dreams that refuse to vanish entirely. They linger still in the margins of letters, in the cracks of palace walls, in the memory of a single gaze during a wedding that was never truly hers. Thus the chronicles close this chapter with customary praise. The princess fulfilled her duty, the empire endured. But the parchment, when held to the light, reveals faint impressions where ink once bled through, words erased by censors or time. They seem to form a question, impossible to read completely, yet unmistakable in intent. Who remembers the bride? The archivist lowers the page. The silence of centuries gathers once more, heavy as the scent of incense, waiting for the next name to be written. The ink on the marriage contract had scarcely dried when preparations began for the final rite. In the chronicles, it is described as the night of union, a term meant to convey sanctity, but within the palace the phrase carried a different weight. It signified the completion of a transaction, the moment when alliance was sealed not by signature, but by flesh. Every empire has its ceremonies. This was the most private and the most public at once. What happened behind a closed door could alter the balance of power across continents. From early morning, the palace vibrated with controlled urgency. Servants scrubbed marble floors until they shone like water. Musicians rehearsed slow, hypnotic rhythms meant to accompany the feast. The air was thick with incense, amber, rose, and musk, meant to purify, to bless, to disguise the human scent of fear. Outside, soldiers guarded the gates. Inside, women moved through corridors carrying trays of perfumes, bowls of sugared almonds, bolts of embroidered linen. The entire household performed as if the happiness of the empire depended on precision. In a sense, it did. The consummation of a royal marriage validated the alliance. Without it, rumors of weakness could spread. Eunuchs were charged to stand watch near the bridal chamber, ensuring propriety. Matrons of the court, older women trusted by the dynasty, supervised the rituals that led to the doors closing. Every act, from the arrangement of candles to the tying of ribbons on the bride's gown, had been prescribed centuries earlier, codified into unspoken law. Even the color of the light mattered. Too bright, and the room would appear vulgar. Too dim, and suspicion might arise that something unholy was being concealed. At dusk, the call to prayer echoed across the city. The princess, veiled in crimson silk, was led to the chamber by attendants chanting verses for blessing. Her steps were measured, her eyes fixed upon the floor. In her hands, she carried a small mirror, symbol of purity, though she was forbidden to look into it. Outside the door, the musicians fell silent. A hush spread through the palace like a physical thing, heavy and expectant. The chronicles do not describe what followed. They could not. Instead, they speak of the fulfillment of divine order, a phrase that conceals more than it reveals. Within that silence lies the truth that history was not permitted to record. The trembling of a girl unaccustomed to touch. The presence of a man elevated to power by this very union. The negotiation between duty and dread. For the empire, it was a moment of triumph. For the woman, a passage from identity to anonymity. Some accounts, fragmentary, whispered through generations of servants, suggest that the ritual began with recitation, the bride and groom seated apart while an imam invoked blessing. Afterward, the attendants withdrew, leaving a single candle burning. Its flame would testify that the act had occurred, its smoke rising as witness to the union of state and flesh. To ensure legitimacy, the linens were examined at dawn. The practice was said to guard honor. In truth, it reduced intimacy to evidence. What emotions stirred in that room no record preserves, yet the walls of such chambers still seem to hold an echo. The creak of floorboards, the faint exhale of fear. The princess, taught all her life that obedience was virtue, now faced the final lesson. That even her body was a territory of empire. In yielding, she became both citizen and sacrifice. For the husband, this night confirmed his elevation. To be chosen as consort of a royal daughter was both privilege and peril. He knew that spies would note his behavior, that any rumor of disrespect could cost him everything. Thus, he too performed a role scripted by generations. His gentleness, if any existed, was measured. His dominance, if expressed, was calculated. The marriage bed was a stage upon which loyalty itself was tested. At dawn, the palace awoke to ceremony once more. The musicians resumed their music, servants carried trays of sherbet, and the elders offered prayers of thanksgiving. Outside the chamber, the matrons reappeared, faces expressionless. The candle had burned low. The linen was folded and placed within a chest to be sealed and sent to the capital. Its presence there would reassure the Sultan that order prevailed, that his daughter had fulfilled her destiny. No one asked how she felt. The empire had no language for such questions. Later that morning, she emerged, veiled again, moving slowly through the courtyard toward her private apartments. Those who saw her wrote that she appeared serene, radiant even. They mistook composure for contentment. Within, she carried the knowledge that her freedom had ended not with chains, but with ceremony. The music swelled around her, a triumphal march that sounded, to her ears, like a dirge. In the weeks that followed, life resumed its rhythm. Guests visited to offer congratulations. Poets composed verses comparing her to the moon. Artisans presented jewels as tokens of loyalty. She accepted them all with measured grace, but behind the elaborate courtesies lay a new and more intimate kind of solitude. The nights stretched long, filled with the sound of the sea and the rustle of curtains. The husband came and went according to his duties, each visit announced by ritual, each departure marked by silence. The princess learned to occupy the hours between. For the empire, these marriages were living symbols of harmony. In reality, they were delicate negotiations between fear and decorum. A princess who failed to conceive risked humiliation. One who conceived too soon risked political imbalance. Her body became the site of prophecy. Midwives consulted, physicians summoned, astrologers asked to interpret her dreams. If she fell ill, prayers were ordered across the province. If she appeared melancholy, clerics reminded her that sorrow was ingratitude to God. The machinery of care was indistinguishable from control. Occasionally, reports reached the capital that a royal wife had refused her husband's bed, claiming illness or devotion. Such refusals could not be tolerated. Messengers were dispatched with discreet instructions. Remind her of her duty, of the eyes upon her, of the honor of her lineage. Most yielded. A few did not. The chronicles omit their names but record, in the language of bureaucracy, that certain difficulties were resolved. The euphemism covers a multitude of fates: confinement, divorce, disappearance. Among the scattered manuscripts of the period survives a prayer written in an unfamiliar hand. It begins as a plea for forgiveness, but shifts midway into something else, a confession perhaps, or a lament. The writer asks not for deliverance but for remembrance. Let my name be spoken once after I am gone, even if only in whisper. The ink fades before the sentence ends. Historians cannot say whose hand wrote it, but the handwriting resembles that of several letters known to have come from royal wives, exiled to distant estates. Whether it belonged to one of them, or to another entirely, no one can prove. Still, the words remain, fragile as breath, surviving centuries of neglect. The architecture of the bridal chamber itself speaks of contradiction. Designed for privacy, it also served as proof of possession. Intricate lattice screens allowed air to flow but prevented escape. The single door could be locked from the outside. The bed, carved from cedar and inlaid with mother-of-pearl, stood upon a dais like an altar. Around it hung curtains so thick they absorbed sound. To an outsider it might appear opulent. To the bride it must have felt like a tomb furnished in luxury. Such rooms still exist in the remnants of Ottoman palaces scattered across Anatolia and the Balkans. Tour guides describe them as examples of fine craftsmanship. Few mention what they once contained. Yet when the light slants through the lattices at certain hours, dust swirls in shapes that seem almost human. A trick of air, perhaps, or memory refusing to die. The stones remember even when people do not. For the princess, nights became indistinguishable from one another. The rituals continued, the visits, the prayers, the expectation of heirs. She spoke less, smiled when required, walked the gardens under guard. To the servants she appeared untouchable, almost holy. In truth, she was learning the art of invisibility, the only power left to her. Within silence, she discovered a kind of endurance. It was not happiness. but it was survival. The empire, ever vigilant, measured success in stability. As long as no scandal reached the capital, the system was declared perfect. The pain of individuals vanished into statistics of governance. When a princess died young, it was attributed to fate. When she lived long, to virtue. The distinction mattered little to her. What remained constant was the knowledge that her story, whatever it was, would end in a single line of a chronicle written by men who had never spoken her name aloud. Sometimes, in rare moments of solitude, she would return to that mirror from her wedding night. Its surface had dulled over time, the silver backing tarnished. When she looked into it, she saw not her own face but a blur of candlelight. The reflection belonged to no one. She would trace the rim with her finger, remembering the day she had been forbidden to look. In that gesture lay a small act of defiance, the reclaiming of a self the empire had tried to erase. Outside, life continued with the indifferent grandeur of history. The call to prayer rose and fell. Ships came and went. New wars began. Within her chambers, the princess aged slowly, her world shrinking to the dimensions of her duties. Yet the night of her wedding remained suspended in memory, not as an event, but as a threshold she had never truly crossed. It was the moment when the empire entered her life and never left. To those who study the old records, that night appears as a blank space, a deliberate omission. But sometimes the margins reveal traces invisible to casual eyes. A smudge where ink was wiped away, a faint indentation of words scraped off by a censor's knife. Under certain light, the lines reappear, half legible. They read, "She trembled, yet she bowed. The candle shook, yet it did not go out." The rest is lost. What remains is the silence, thick, enduring, merciless. The silence that filled that room when the door closed. The silence that spread through her life like a second skin. The silence that outlived empires. To hear it even now is to understand what the chroniclers could not admit. That the true foundation of power is not triumph but submission, not glory but fear. And fear, once born, never truly dies. The archivist turns another page. The parchment crackles softly, like the whisper of a curtain drawn shut. Somewhere beyond the walls, the sea continues its endless motion, indifferent to the stories it has witnessed. In that rhythm, the ebb and flow, the retreat and return, one hears the echo of that first night, when a princess of the Ottoman Empire stepped into the darkness and became part of history's unending tide. Years passed, and the empire changed its skin again. Sultans died, sons ascended, provinces rebelled, then returned to obedience. Across the map, borders swelled and contracted like the breath of a giant creature. Yet within the private estates of the royal wives, time seemed motionless. The courtyards where fountains once sang grew silent. Marble cracked. Roses bloomed and withered unnoticed. The princess remained, an emblem of loyalty, too sacred to dismiss, too inconvenient to remember. Her letters from this period survive in fragments, copied by clerks who understood only half of what they transcribed. They speak of health, of prayer, of gratitude for imperial mercy. But between the polite phrases lie fissures where something more human struggles to surface. Brief mentions of fever that might mean despair. Comments on the weather that disguise loneliness. In one she writes, "The nights are long here. and the stars seem to know our names. Scholars debate whether she meant faith or fatigue. Perhaps she herself no longer knew the difference. Her husband's fortunes waxed and waned with politics. A governor's success was never his own. It depended on the intrigue of ministers, the favor of generals, the whim of the sultan. When suspicion touched him, as it touched everyone eventually, the princess became collateral. Imperial messengers arrived under the guise of ceremony, bearing courteous words that hid orders. The husband was summoned to the capital. She was told to remain for her safety. Within weeks, his name disappeared from the registers. The next entry concerning her estate begins simply, "The lady was relocated to a residence of appropriate dignity." No explanation follows. The empire did not explain. Thus began her second captivity. Removed from her former palace, she was installed in a smaller one on the outskirts of the city, overlooking the sea but forbidden to travel to it. The servants were strangers, chosen for discretion rather than loyalty. Each morning she heard the call to prayer drift through iron-grilled windows, reminding her that devotion did not equal deliverance. Her household shrank. Her world contracted to the length of a corridor, and the view of a horizon she could not reach. The empire called this seclusion honorary rest. Many such confinements are recorded in code across the archives. Some lasted months, others decades. A few ended mercifully in quiet deaths. Others ended abruptly when further security measures were deemed necessary. To live under suspicion was to breathe uncertainty with every prayer. Rumor alone could destroy a name. Servants, fearing guilt by association, spoke in whispers or not at all. Even silence became dangerous, for it could be interpreted as defiance. Within that isolation, some royal women turned inward to religion, fasting until frailty became its own form of protest. Others wrote poetry under pseudonyms, their verses circulating secretly through scholars who admired the anonymous hand from the sea. One cycle of poems speaks of a caged bird that sings to remember its song, not to be heard. The imagery recurs in later generations, echoed by writers who never knew its origin. In that persistence, one senses the ghost of her voice, carried forward like smoke. There were, of course, those who chose a swifter escape. The imperial records treat such endings with decorum. The lady fell suddenly ill and was received by mercy, they say, or the lady passed peacefully in the night. Behind those words lies a spectrum of possibilities. Poison mixed with honey, a plunge into the Bosphorus, a scarf knotted too tightly. The empire could not afford scandal. Compassion was disguised as inevitability. To die quietly was the final service a princess could render. On rare occasions, one dared to resist in life rather than in death. Chroniclers, cautious yet fascinated, hint at episodes of defiance. A certain royal wife in Anatolia refused to yield her estates after her husband's disgrace. She barricaded herself with loyal guards until imperial troops surrounded the palace. When they broke in, they found her seated on her throne, dressed in mourning white. She surrendered without struggle, saying only, "I was born behind a door that never opens twice." The phrase entered folklore. The woman vanished into the archives. These incidents unsettled the court, for they revealed cracks in the facade of obedience. The Sultan's advisors debated reforms, greater stipends, stricter supervision. But the system itself endured. It always endured. Empires, like religions, are sustained by ritual, and ritual demands sacrifice. The daughters of the dynasty remained its most eloquent offerings. By middle age, the princess's beauty had faded into legend. Visitors described her as dignified, remote, her features softened by resignation. Children from nearby villages glimpsed her veiled silhouette on balconies and invented stories that she was a saint, that she could heal with a glance, that her tears turned to pearls. In truth, she lived in a rhythm of repetition: prayer, reading, silence. The mirror from her wedding night still stood on her dressing table, its glass fractured by age. She kept it covered with cloth, perhaps to prevent the past from gazing back. Occasionally, emissaries from the capital came to inquire after her welfare. They were polite, efficient, incurious. One of them, a young official newly appointed, recorded privately his impressions. "The lady spoke with calm," he wrote, "but her eyes were fixed upon something beyond the walls, as if she were listening to a sound we could not hear." He left that evening, convinced he had witnessed sanctity. He had, in truth, witnessed survival. Outside her walls, the empire entered its own twilight. Wars drained its coffers, and new ideas crept in from Europe: reform, equality, freedom. Words that once belonged to philosophers now reached the bazaars. Yet within the sanctuaries of the imperial family, time stood still. The daughters continued to be married for alliances. The wives continued to live in precaution. The system that had consumed generations persisted out of habit, like an echo repeating itself until meaning evaporated. When the princess died, peacefully, the record insists, her body was returned to Istanbul. The procession was modest, escorted by a handful of officials and a closed litter draped in green velvet. At the family mausoleum, prayers were recited by rote. The stone carved for her bore only titles, no name. The empire preferred anonymity. It transformed women into symbols and symbols into silence. The burial entry concludes with the same phrase found on countless others: "May her obedience be remembered." But memory is treacherous. Beneath the official marble, stories continued to circulate, of visions seen by night watchmen, of faint singing heard near the sea. In one account, a guard claimed that during the new moon he saw a figure veiled in crimson walking toward the water. She left no footprints. Whether apparition or invention, the tale spread among the servants of the palace, who whispered that the princesses never truly departed. They merely changed form, haunting the empire that had imprisoned them. Such legends serve a purpose. They express what history forbids: remorse. Empires rarely apologize, but myths do it for them. The ghost of the obedient bride becomes the conscience of the dynasty, wandering through time as reminder and reproach. Even centuries later, when the palaces became museums and tourists traced their fingers along the tiles, guides would lower their voices when describing the women's quarters. The air there feels cooler, they say, as if the walls remember. In those corridors, the architecture itself seems to mourn. The painted ceilings darken despite restoration. The fountains refuse to flow. The very stones appear tired of magnificence. One might imagine that if the ghosts of the princesses still linger, they do not seek vengeance but recognition, a single moment of acknowledgement that they once existed beyond ceremony. Among the archives of the last Ottoman generation lies a small notebook kept by an imperial librarian. In it he catalogued damaged documents salvaged from the fires of war. One entry reads simply, "Letter without signature, dated uncertain, contains verses of remarkable sadness." The text, reproduced on the facing page, consists of 3 lines. I was a promise spoken between men. I was a name given to peace, and peace forgot my name. No scholar has identified its author. Perhaps it was written by the very princess whose life these pages have followed. Perhaps by another, whose story ended the same way. In either case, the words stand as epitaph for them all. As the 20th century dawned and the empire staggered toward dissolution, reformers opened the royal archives to modern historians. They expected to find glory and strategy. Instead, they found absence. For every decree about conquest, there were 10 concerning marriages. For every victory recorded, a list of dowries. The scholars realized that the empire had been held together not only by armies and gold, but by the quiet endurance of women whose names it barely preserved. The revelation was unsettling, like discovering that the foundation of a monument rests upon forgotten bones. Today, those bones rest beneath the gardens of Istanbul, beneath fountains where visitors toss coins for luck. They lie in anonymity, yet their silence shapes the air. To walk those paths is to feel a weight that is not quite sorrow and not quite guilt, but something between. A recognition that every empire is haunted by its own design. The archivist closes the final dossier, the parchment edges frayed by time. Dust swirls in the light from the window, particles rising and falling like souls reluctant to settle. Outside, the call to prayer begins again, echoing over the Bosphorus. The same sound that once reached the ears of brides waiting in their chambers. The city listens, unaware that within the resonance of that ancient chant, their voices still tremble, and in that tremor lives the truth no chronicle could bear to record, that beneath the triumphs of sultans and the splendor of domes, the empire's most enduring legacy is the quiet sorrow of its daughters, women who loved without permission, obeyed without reward, and died without names, leaving behind only the memory of a closed door and the faint scent of rosewater lingering in the dark. The sound of the muezzin drifts across the Bosphorus, weaving through the domes and minarets like smoke from an invisible fire. Istanbul awakens as it has for centuries, ships gliding across the water, pigeons scattering from the courtyards, the call and response of a city layered upon itself. Yet within the stones, something remains unsaid. Beneath the noise of life lies the murmur of those who once inhabited silence. The empire is gone, its banners folded, its palaces turned to museums, but its daughters have never entirely departed. Their absence has become the city's most persistent presence. In the archives, the parchment has grown brittle. Historians handle the pages as one might cradle a dying flame, cautious not to let it flicker out. They find the same refrain repeated across generations. Marriages arranged, estates assigned, obedience praised. The pattern is hypnotic in its precision, a music of bureaucracy. Yet in between the lines, those thin spaces where ink has faded, they sense another rhythm, faint but insistent. The rhythm of breathing, of endurance, of a life lived behind curtains. What official history declared resolved still vibrates in those gaps, as if the past were resisting erasure. Visitors to Topkapi walk through the women's quarters now with guided whispers in their ears. They see the tiled walls glimmering in turquoise and gold, the lattice windows carved into star-shaped patterns, the courtyards where fountains once sang. The guide speaks of artistry, of craftsmanship, of imperial taste. Few speak of fear. But sometimes, when the crowd moves on and the corridor empties, the air shifts. A draught stirs the curtains, and the faint scent of rosewater rises from nowhere. Those who pause long enough to notice it feel a chill, not of cold, but of recognition. The walls are breathing. For centuries, the empire had measured its power by what it could command: armies, tribute, faith. Yet its endurance depended on what it could silence. The women of its dynasty were the keepers of that silence, shaping it into ritual, polishing it until it gleamed like virtue. In doing so, they became invisible and indispensable at once. The paradox remains. Without their obedience, the empire might have fractured. Because of their obedience, their own stories dissolved. Modern scholars debate the morality of judgment. They ask whether the past should be condemned by the standards of the present, whether these women were victims or participants in a system that sustained them even as it consumed them. The question has no answer. The documents are too careful, the centuries too long. What survives are gestures, echoes, hints, the way a name appears once and then vanishes, the way a prayer ends abruptly mid-line. The historian reads, pauses, and imagines the unspoken continuation. In that act of imagination lies both empathy and guilt. In one forgotten notebook discovered among the possessions of a late imperial archivist, there is a marginal note written in delicate script. If history is written by the victors, who writes for those who obeyed? The question haunts every page that follows. The answer, perhaps, is no one, or everyone who dares to listen. For the obedient rarely leave records. They leave impressions, faint as the pressure of a hand upon parchment. Over time, those impressions become the very texture of the page. Outside the palace, the modern city surges forward. Electric lights replace torches. The hum of traffic replaces the clatter of hooves. The Bosphorus still gleams under the same moon that once witnessed imperial processions, but its reflection is fractured by ferries and bridges. The skyline, pierced by steel, glows with the color of progress. Yet even in this new world, traces of the old persist. The cadence of prayer, the curve of an arch, the way evening light turns the domes to copper. The city carries its ghosts with pride, disguised as indifference. Some nights, scholars claim, the sea, near the old palace, turns strangely calm. The water smooths as if listening. The fishermen anchored nearby hear nothing, but the air feels charged, as though the unrecorded voices of centuries were gathering just beneath the surface. They say that if one could dive deep enough, one might find the letters, the jewelry, the bits of silk that once adorned forgotten brides, objects cast into the sea to prevent scandal. The tide keeps their secrets, rocking them gently against the stones. Even the water has learned discretion. The story of the Ottoman princesses, when told in full, becomes less a chronicle of individuals than a meditation on power itself. Each woman, born within walls of privilege, carried the empire's contradictions in her veins. She was at once sovereign and subject, sacred and expendable. Her silence was not merely imposed, it was taught as grace. To question was to betray lineage, to desire was to endanger order. Over generations, that discipline became instinct, a second inheritance. Even when the empire fell, the reflex remained. Speak softly, endure, survive. Yet silence, too, can speak. It speaks in the restraint of archives, in the unease of restorers who feel watched as they polish a mirror once belonging to a royal bride. It speaks in the uneaten offerings left by visitors who cannot explain why they leave them. Small flowers, coins, folded notes. Perhaps they sense, unconsciously, that remembrance is a form of justice. Perhaps they understand that the line between devotion and apology is thin as silk. There is a story, unverifiable yet persistent, of a historian who spent years searching for the personal writings of one particular princess, the same whose unsigned prayer had survived in a monastery library. He followed trails through private collections, across continents, through wars and exiles. At last he found a single sheet hidden within a ledger of trade receipts. It contained only 4 words, written in an unsteady hand. "We were not empty." The historian wept. He could not explain why. The words were not confession or accusation, merely existence asserting itself against erasure. They were the whisper of centuries refusing to vanish. To read such fragments is to confront the fragility of all human record. Empires rise to immortalize themselves, yet every empire ends as paper, every monument as dust. What endures are the things least intended to survive: the sighs, the small mercies, the remembered fears. The daughters of the Ottoman dynasty did not choose their fates, but they defined an era by living them. In their stillness lies the measure of endurance, in their silence the vocabulary of survival. As dusk falls over Istanbul, the call to prayer merges with the horns of ships departing for distant ports. The light fades across the domes of Topkapi, turning gold to gray. Inside the museum halls, visitors drift away, leaving the courtyards empty. The fountains murmur again, though no water flows. Somewhere within the women's quarters, a single candle, part of an old display, burns low, its wick curling like a memory. The flame flickers, and for an instant the tiled walls seem to ripple with movement, as if the shadows themselves were shifting. Then the light steadies, and the illusion fades. Only the echo remains. In that echo resides a truth both simple and unbearable. The empire that once ruled half the world was built not only upon conquest but upon consent. Consent shaped, enforced, inherited. The women who bore that burden gave it the dignity of devotion, transforming submission into art, patience into power. Their lives were not footnotes, they were foundations. Without them, the empire's brilliance would have crumbled under its own weight. Yet history, in its haste to glorify kings, mistook their endurance for silence. Perhaps this is why, even now, the city dreams of them. In the lull between night and dawn, when the Bosphorus is still and the first birds stir, a strange calm settles over the old palace. The guards on duty say the temperature drops, though no wind blows. Some claim to hear footsteps in the tiled corridors, the rustle of silk, the faint rhythm of a lullaby sung in a language no one remembers. The rational mind dismisses it as imagination. But imagination, after all, is another form of memory. The archivist who closes the final volume senses this. He feels the weight of centuries in his hands, the delicate balance between reverence and regret. Before replacing the book on the shelf, he hesitates and adds a single note in the margin. The silence continues. Then he blows out the lamp. The room plunges into darkness, but the scent of ink and paper lingers. The same scent that once perfumed the dowries of forgotten brides. Outside, dawn gathers over the water. The city stirs again, vendors setting up stalls, fishermen casting nets. children running through alleys once patrolled by imperial guards. Life persists, indifferent yet inheriting. And somewhere in that persistence lies redemption. The acknowledgement, however fleeting, that every age owes its peace to the unnamed who endured in its shadow. They were born in palaces of gold, yet their legacy is carved not in marble but in memory. It exists in the pause before a prayer, in the stillness of a room where light filters through lattice. It exists in the awareness that behind every triumph, someone was silent. That silence, finally heard, becomes their monument. The Bosphorus glimmers once more, reflecting the pale light of morning. The empire has long since dissolved into republic and rumor, its banners stored in museums, its decrees unread. But the tide remembers. Each wave that touches the shore carries the faintest echo of those who once feared the night and learned to outlast it. Even the water seems to whisper, as if answering a question no one dares to ask. Do you remember us? And in that whisper, almost lost beneath the noise of the living world, comes the reply that history has waited centuries to hear. Soft, defiant, eternal. We were never silent. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.